From the debauched orgies of the Marquis de Sade to the bundling boards of our austere pilgrim fathers. From frigid Victorian wives to the golden age of prostitution and pornography. From the late 17th century until the year 1900, human sexuality finally broke away from the dictates of the church, only to become a pendulum, wildly swinging between the often very political extremes of repression and excess. Across the expansive globe known as the Western world, the dark centuries of the Middle Ages were beginning to fade into memory. The spiritual wrestling match between Protestant upstarts and Catholics resulted in a new age in which writers and philosophers openly challenged the doctrines of the Church. What once was sacred was now open to interpretation and to experimentation. Especially that ubiquitous human desire described by 17th century English playwright William Shakespeare as the beast with two backs. The bawdy sexual antics of the bard's immortal characters reflected the new, unfettered morality of his generation. Yet it was another 17th century playwright, the Spanish monk Tirso de Molina, who truly set the tone for the debauched decades to come. In 1630, at the height of the Catholic Church's repressive Inquisition, Molina's mythical Don Juan is a heartless trickster willing to lie, cheat, and steal to seduce the women he desires.
Don Juan is very much an index of the decadence of the time. Always, when you have a society that's so tightly structured and controlled, there are going to be tremendous temptations for and opportunities for transgression. And the 1630 play is very clearly an indication of that.
At the end of the play, Don Juan is pitched into hell, sending a clear message that seduction doesn't pay. A century later, the same character appears again in the Mozart opera Don Giovanni, having evolved into a romantic hero in love with love itself. This kinder, gentler Don Juan may have been modeled after a real flesh-and-blood lover, Giacomo Girolamo Casanova.
Casanova was born in the 18th century. The century of enlightenment, of rational skepticism in which philosophers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Helvetius questioned the traditional church authorities, the dogmas, and the morality that had been enforced until then. Casanova's views of sexuality have to be seen very much in that context. What he believed was that pleasure was a good. It was not intrinsically evil. It was God-given, and therefore the seeking of pleasure was compatible with religious faith.
The pleasure-seeking Casanova initially dreamed of a career in the church. Born in 1725, he left his home city of Venice to become the secretary to a bishop in southern Italy.
He had taken, among other things, a vow of chastity, which he regularly ignored. He dreamed of perhaps one day becoming pope, which shows only that he didn't know himself very well at all.
Casanova's lack of self-awareness soon found him embroiled in a sex scandal. Banished from the Vatican, the randy young man joined the Venetian military. There he acquired the position of cicisbeo to the wife of his commanding officer.
What the cicisbeo was essentially an unofficial or even an official assistant husband. Now, in the 18th century, of course, aristocratic marriages were generally arranged. They were not love marriages. Very often they would involve a younger woman and an older man. And the older man was not particularly interested in accompanying his younger wife on her daily social round. The function would often be delegated to a chisbeo.
As chisbeo, Casanova's duties to the captivating Signora F might have included such intimate tasks as putting on her shoes, bringing her chocolate in bed, and even lacing up her bodice. It wasn't long before he was desperately in love. But his mistress seemed unmoved by Casanova's affections.
Casanova is so frustrated, so in love and so frustrated at his inability to achieve the consummation that he so devoutly wished, that he went out and released his tensions with a local prostitute and promptly picked up a sexually transmitted disease. When thereafter Signora F was ready to allow him the last conquest, he had to explain that he couldn't. And that was the end of that relationship. He resigned his commission in the Venetian military and returned to Venice, a defeated man.
Then, by a stroke of luck, Casanova saved the life of a nobleman who showered him with wealth and privilege. With financing behind him, he was able to embark on the 122 romantic escapades that fill his 12-volume autobiography. Casanova's L'Histoire de ma vie describes in detail everything from liaisons with cross-dressing opera singers to group sex with nuns.
What makes Casanova unique in the annals of sexual history is not the number of affairs that he had. Any self-respecting rock star or sports superstar can have more affairs than he did. What is truly unique for Casanova, and in the context of Casanova's century, is that he loved more than women's bodies. He says at one point that a woman's conversation is more than half the pleasure in love.
Casanova's erotic escapades epitomized the philosophy of the libertines, champions for freedom of passions and sexual appetites. Another 18th century libertine took this pursuit of pleasure to shocking extremes. Unlike Casanova, who adored women and delighted in their pleasure, François-Alphonse Donatien, Marquis de Sade, fantasized about their pain.
Sade, he really hates women. There is also a great antipathy to the idea of shared pleasure. He several times writes that a woman having pleasure diminishes the pleasure of the man.
The optimum pleasure is attained by the most violent possible shock. Juliette by the Marquis de Sade.
The Marquis de Sade was born in 1740 into a family of high-ranking but perennially penniless nobles.
He was a very distant cousin of the kings, of the Bourbons who were reigning in France, had been reigning in France for several centuries. But it had a huge influence on his own thinking. It made him feel totally above the law, beyond the law, unpunishable. He could permit himself any excess.
Sade's youth took shape during one of the most sexually excessive periods of European history. During the early and mid-18th century, the regent's court at Versailles was home to drunken orgies and a buffet of debauchery for all tastes and preferences. The young Marquis was witness to such excesses, having spent his early years with his uncle, a clergyman who nevertheless kept a handy stable of loose women on call at his estate.
And then he's sent to a boarding school in France, a Jesuit boarding school, where he sits until the age of 14, where the priests, the teachers, are renowned to be highly homosexual, and where there's a tradition of publicly flogging the students.
Saad married for money in 1763. Soon after, he began to display predilections for perverse and violent sexual adventures. He whipped and psychologically tortured a young woman, but escaped with little more than a slap on his aristocratic wrist. His true downfall began after an orgy with his valet and 5 prostitutes, whom he made violently ill with aphrodisiac-laced candies.
The next morning, the whores went to the police and complained, and they could therefore level a charge of attempted poisoning. But in the same breath, the whores knew what they were doing. They leveled charges of sodomy, because it was officially on the law books. It was an offense punishable by death. And don't tell me the nobles didn't practice it all the time.
Fed up with young nobles and their hedonistic excesses, the powerful bourgeois courts of pre-revolutionary France made Saad the whipping boy for their political crusade. Imprisoned on and off for a total of 27 years, Saad didn't waste his time in jail. He channeled his repressed sexual energy into penning, anonymously of course, some of the most outrageous pornographic novels ever written. Tales of bondage, rape, torture, mutilation, and bestiality.
More than 300 persons were already assembled, all of them naked. They were busy sodomizing, whacking each other off, whipping each other, engaging in fellatio, coming to orgasm. All of this in the greatest calm. One could only hear whatever noise was necessitated by the circumstances.
The rise and fall of the Marquis de Sade epitomizes the ebb and flow of sexual politics in history. While the libertines had succeeded in breaking down the taboos of 18th century Europe, they had unknowingly initiated a moral backlash. Disgusted and disenchanted with the debauchery of 17th century Europe, the Pilgrims and Puritans of England had fled to the New World, only to discover their own carnal quirks. In the 1630s, the Pilgrims crossed the Atlantic, choosing a perilous voyage and an untamed wilderness over the debauchery and corruption of 17th century Europe. Along with their hopes for a better life, the Pilgrims and Puritans brought with them the belief that all of God's creatures were damned from the womb. A dutiful Puritan was supposed to censor every aspect of his or her behavior, including unconscious thoughts. Thy heart is a foul sink of all atheism, sodomy, blasphemy, murder, whoredom, adultery, witchcraft, buggery, so that if thou hast any good thing in thee, it is but as a drop of rose water in a bowl of poison. Reverend Thomas Shepard, 1640. Ironically, the effects of these fire and brimstone sermons seemed to wear off even before the church pews had gone cold.
If you go back and read court cases, and you see what people were actually doing as opposed to what ministers were saying. I've spent many a happy hour in an archive reading about family incest, about potential lesbian relationships, about adultery, about men and farmyard animals, about women who had casual sex on the road going between their farm and someone else's farm, about love on the woodpile, so that, yes, Virginia, there was sex in colonial society.
A vital half of the sexual equation, colonial women were in short supply. In the tobacco colonies of the South, one woman for every 6 men created a diminished dating pool that was a boon to ladies with checkered pasts. As desperate, marriage-minded men turned a blind eye to their intended's past indiscretions.
What colonial society was interested in was the results of sex, not so much sex itself. About 60% of all Puritan women got married pregnant. If you got pregnant and the man married you, that was fine.
If a man didn't own up to his fatherly duties, and if the woman remained tight-lipped about his identity, Puritan courts had a way of settling paternity disputes. This method might best be described as 12 angry women.
Many of the court cases involved an informal jury of 12 women who would gather around a young woman who was giving birth, who was unmarried, and in the pains of labor, they would act as inquisitors. Who's the father? Who's the father of this child? Who made you pregnant? And the assumption was that in the pain of labor, a woman would be unable to lie. And the goal was to find the man, make him be responsible for the child.
17th century delivery rooms weren't the only cramped quarters in colonial America. Because of brutally cold winters and a dearth of living space, an entire family would often share a single bed. When a boy was courting a girl and stayed too late at her home, he might receive an invitation to share ye olde family bed with a few provisions. A piece of wood, known as a bundling board, was placed between the young lovers to prevent any late-night hanky-panky.
It's rather interesting to think about the sexual dynamics of this household. It's a cold winter night. The husband and wife are asleep either in the same bed, near them in another bed. They might be having intercourse, and here's the young woman and the young man, and they might be having intercourse, and here are the other children and maybe the household servants sleeping in the same room. These are the things historians would love to know. How you made love in a room full of people.
This disquieting lack of privacy extended outside the family bedroom. Thanks to colonial urban planning, town busybodies delighted in keeping tabs on their neighbors' adulterous shenanigans.
Houses were right up against one another. Windows were low. And we'll find court records where neighbors will testify. I saw them committing adultery. I leaned right in that window and I said to her, "Don't you do that. You know you're not supposed to do that. You're a married woman. Go home."
Peeping Tom pilgrims, bundling boards, and the occasional fling with a farm animal must have appeared strange to the original inhabitants of North America. For thousands of years, the Native Americans had maintained their own unique views of sex and sexuality. Views starkly different from their new, fair-skinned neighbors. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the four European superpowers, England, France, Spain, and Holland, were in hot competition for New World empires. Europeans varied in their response to the indigenous peoples of North America. French settlers in Canada learned to speak Indian languages and freely intermarried with Native Americans. But in the English colonies, it was a completely different story.
The English society is not known as the get down and boogie society. Europeans in general, and the English in particular, truly believed that they were the superior culture.
The truth was, most white settlers had no desire to understand Indian culture, especially when it came to concepts of sexuality. Because of their diversity, it's impossible to characterize the many Native American nations as having a single attitude toward sex, except that it was universally viewed as a vital, natural life force. marriages were genuine and tender love matches. Hunting cultures like the Huron tended to be more male-dominated, while in agrarian cultures like the Wampanoag of New England, women held the power and status.
In a culture where men did not control property and men did not control economic survival, you have a very different standard for moral behavior and sexual behavior. And we know that some white colonial women liked this better, because when Indians would raid towns on the borders of the colonies and take captives, white men would ride out and rescue them from the heathens. And that night they would make camp, and when the colonial men woke up in the morning, the women had all fled back to the Indian camps. They had all left.
As the American colonies prospered, their demand for cheap labor increased, introducing an enormous influx of African slaves. Wrenched from their ancestral homes, the Africans brought with them views of sexuality in many ways similar to those of the Native Americans, but even more foreign to white European settlers.
I think one of the major things that we can see going from Africa to the U.S. is the sense of sex as powerful, pleasurable, and generative.
Unlike American colonists who regarded sex simply as a means of procreation, the transplanted Africans from a myriad of tribes and countries often saw a distinct separation between sexuality and fertility. Even as these slaves struggled to preserve their beliefs and traditions in a hostile new land, back in their native country, ancient sexual practices continued to flourish and can still be found, often unchanged, today. For African teenagers, the initiation rite was of utmost importance in both pre-colonial times and even today. Around the ages of 11 or 12, young men and women began their extensive education in matters of sex, marriage, and procreation.
During the initiation time period, there are also dances that are taught that may mimic certain kinds of sexual activities. Lots and lots of discussion about childbirth and about the nature of that and how to prepare for it. Discussions around how to please a spouse.
The concept of virginity varied from tribe to tribe. In some communities, both women and men were expected to remain celibate until marriage. For women in many tribal cultures, the final aspect of initiation remains a subject of controversy to this day. Upon reaching the age of womanhood, a girl had to undergo a painful procedure known as a clitoridectomy, in which their clitoris was removed. This was often a prerequisite for marriage.
And there's a whole host of things that people say about why to have the operation, including it'll make you a complete woman, it will increase your possibilities for fertility, it will dull your sexual appetite. But a lot of it today boils down to what will be your chances of getting married.
Marriage itself differed greatly from the New World version of the ritual. Just as the Africans made distinctions between sexuality and fertility, so too did spouses differentiate between sexuality and intimacy.
It is with members of the same sex that you're going to have your most intimate relations. You might not expect to have romantic love and an intimate emotional relationship with your sex partner, your wife or your husband. You might expect to have that kind of relationship with your close friends, that you're going to hug them, you're going to walk down the street holding their hands.
In some African societies, both married and single women of wealth and status had the option of taking wives of their own. These were platonic business arrangements, allowing the primary wife to establish her own family line within a patrilineal community. While men and women could both act as husbands in some African societies, in others, the sexes were separate but parallel, up until the arrival of European colonists in the 1700s.
When the colonialists came, they didn't look for women in power. They didn't see that there were women in power, and those positions gradually became less and less important, and a number of them disappeared.
Once forced to the shores of a strange new world, many of the Africans' rich traditions continued to be diluted. African Americans were compelled to adapt to a life in which families could be torn apart at the whim of a plantation owner. Part of their cultural survival depended on two time-honored African values: the unconditional veneration of motherhood and the concept that raising children was a responsibility that belonged to the entire community. After the Civil War, African Americans found themselves free citizens in a country swept up in the frenzy of the Victorian period, an era of rigid family values imported from Britain. The Puritans' exodus from Europe had been triggered by the excesses of the 17th and 18th centuries. Now, in 19th century Britain, a new brand of family values was taking the empire by storm, championed by the explosion of an increasingly moneyed and powerful middle class.
The middle class grows in this period. So they look at the old aristocracy and said they're immoral, they behave badly, they drink too much, they have riotous sex, they sleep with people to whom they're not married. And one of the ways in which we can be different is by being moral.
The 17-year-old Germanic princess Victoria took the throne in 1837, inheriting a court that had been filled with the same scandal, hedonism, and corruption that had defined most of 18th century Europe. When the pure and virginal Victoria chose Albert as prince consort, their obvious affection for one another and their allegiance to home and hearth helped resurrect the ideals of romantic love within the tidy Protestant context of marriage. Middle-class marriages during Victoria's reign were characterized by the very different spheres in which husbands and wives moved.
Men were to be breadwinners and go out into the world, and that was the public world. And the private world was the world of women, the domestic sphere, where they were to be housewives and mothers and angels in the household, which was a common Victorian ideology.
Though it wasn't fodder for proper conversation, sex within marriage was seen as a normal and healthy function, provided it was for purposes of procreation. This was not only a moral dictate, but a medical one as well.
Some doctors believed that you could have too much sex, but there was a strong sense amongst almost all doctors that boys, adolescent boys in particular, shouldn't be allowed to overspend. So we see all sorts of incredibly weird and cruel contraptions which were, put on little boys' penises at night to stop them from masturbating, to stop them from having nocturnal emissions.
Uptight doctors also wrote sex manuals which stressed the importance of limiting sex, even within marriage, from once a month to twice a year, depending on which one you read. These handy guidebooks dictated that a good Victorian wife should be warm and loving toward her husband, but sexually indifferent in the bedroom. Dr. William Acton, one of the medical movers and shakers of the period, was an enthusiastic advocate of the frigid wife ideal. The best mothers, wives, and managers of households know little or nothing of sexual indulgences. Love of home, children, and domestic duties are the only passions they feel. She submits to her husband only to please him, and but for the desire for maternity, would far rather be removed from his attentions. Dr. William Acton.
There is the classic story that the Princess Royal asked her mother, Queen Victoria, "Mommy, you know, what should I know about sex?" And Victoria said, "Close your eyes and think of England." Even if it's apocryphal for Victoria, represents what even many women in their diaries wrote about what they knew about sex before marriage, which was basically absolutely nothing.
The concept of the honeymoon first emerged during the Victorian age, a symbolic separation of the couple from their families, as well as a time of sexual initiation. For women and men with little or no previous carnal knowledge, this hallowed occasion could also become the vacation from hell. One famous fiasco took place following the wedding of writer John Ruskin and the beautiful Effie Gray. When he first saw the naked body of his wife, Ruskin was appalled by her pubic hair and refused to consummate the marriage.
He saw something that disgusted him and that was unlike the Greek statues, which are his primary source of information about what a woman's body should look like. But the point is that Effie did not know what was missing from her marriage. Effie came from a very educated family. It is very powerful evidence that there was a lot of ignorance about sexuality on the part of women.
After 6 years of celibacy, Effie finally saw the light and obtained an annulment. She later formed a passionate union with the artist Robert Millet, proving that, despite popular stereotypes, many Victorian women did enjoy ardent sexual marriages. Astonishingly, much of the misinformation about women's sexual desires and their bodies was perpetuated by the same medical profession that was breaking new ground in every other area of the healing arts.
It was very hard for a medical doctor to understand how a woman's body worked because he couldn't actually see one. It was illegal to do an autopsy on a woman. When a woman had an ailment, a medical doctor was only allowed to touch her in parts that were exposed. And with Victorian clothing, a woman was covered from the neck to her feet.
The level even of gynecological knowledge was just abysmal. When Victoria came to the throne, it was the custom that the Queen would have ladies in waiting. One of those female attendants swelled up, and it looked like one of her ladies in waiting was pregnant. The king's physician examined this woman and declared that yes, indeed, she'd been a naughty girl. But it turned out she was dying of cancer and with a large tumor in her abdomen.
Medical skittishness toward the female anatomy was just one of a litany of Victorian double standards. If good girls had to remain virgins until marriage, if respectable married women weren't supposed to enjoy sex, what was a healthy, virile Victorian man to do?
The other side of the notion that the woman was supposed to save herself and be pure and transmit the genes and the inheritance of the family line was that somebody had to be in it for a good time.
With the explosion of prostitution in Victorian England, there was most certainly a good time to be had by all. The official Victorian embarrassment about anything sexual made the scent of forbidden fruit even more aromatic. For a Victorian man frustrated by his good wife's indifference toward sex, or a woman forced by convention to deny her natural urges, there was an outlet. Then as now, available through the mail, pornography. One of the hottest themes in Victorian erotica involved the forced deflowering of innocent young virgins. Ironically, the prevailing male fantasy in this world, where decent women weren't supposed to be sensual, was the oft-told tale of a virgin who, once ravished, discovers that she really does enjoy sex after all. One very famous Victorian story, The Lustful Turk, is the chronicle of a young white girl who is kidnapped and sold into slavery and the harem of a Turkish sultan. Because of her innocence and beauty, she soon becomes the sultan's favorite. But she will not give in to his lustful advances.
So she keeps saying no and she keeps saying no, and of course, in the end, the Sultan rapes her. And once she has seen what is known in pornography of the period as the throbbing organ, she succumbs and faints with joy after the initial pain, and after that time just keeps begging for more. And I think she ends up getting rescued and isn't too happy about the rescue in the end, but that's the basic story that you'll get in Victorian pornography.
Victorian men for whom the fantasy wasn't enough could find the real thing in the booming business of 19th century prostitution. Like everything else in Victorian society, prostitution operated on a class system. On the highest tier were mistresses and courtesans, often set up in a separate household, almost like a second wife. Even Charles Dickens, that pillar of Victorian values, kept a mistress for 20 years. A 19-year-old actress when she met Dickens, Ellen Ternan later parlayed her profits from the affair into a new identity of middle-class respectability and marriage to a minister. The second class of prostitutes were the brothel workers, who toiled in a hierarchy all their own. From restrictive first-class establishments that functioned like private clubs, to the quick turnover operation of the working-class public house, or in the American West, the saloon. Especially popular in Victorian society were specialized brothels, such as the Houses of Discipline, and other clubs that featured the sexual delicacies of the day, child virgins.
Families even sold those more useless children because that was one way that you could actually get a profit from one of your children.
In 1885, an egomaniacal yellow journalist, William Thomas Stead, purchased a 13-year-old virgin for himself, just to prove how easily it could be done. This publicity stunt resulted in public outrage, and by the end of that year, the law of consent was raised to 16. There still existed an even darker side to Victorian sexuality. The gutter streetwalkers, who plied their trade in a shadow world of crime, degradation, and venereal disease. While upper-class madams made sure to protect their girls with customer inspections and French letters or condoms, the lowest class of prostitutes often lived and died in unimaginable squalor and agony.
Venereal disease was the top fear of every prostitute. It would put them out of business immediately. There wasn't any cures for it.
Whether he brought home venereal diseases to his virtuous wife, dallied with dominatrix, or deflowered child virgins, there was little a Victorian man could do to endanger his social standing.
The only thing I could think of that would definitely ruin him as far as society was concerned was if he was a homosexual. That would be the worst thing that he could possibly do that nobody would forgive.
Despite the fact that many schoolboys had their first sexual experiences with their classmates, and despite a flourishing secret homosexual underworld, several very public scandals made male-male love the ultimate Victorian taboo. The public humiliation and imprisonment of Oscar Wilde, one of the foremost humorists of the day, was the epitome of such intolerance.
Maybe it was building up to that of Oscar Wilde's trial, when all of a sudden these sodomitical practices were put on public display and interpreted in a set of ways that were intended to arouse antipathy.
I was asked by Wilde to imagine that I was a woman and that he was my lover. I used to sit on his knees and he used to play with my privates as a man might amuse himself with a girl. He suggested 2 or 3 times that I should permit him to insert it in my mouth, but I never allowed that. Charles Parker.
Filthy son! Order! Order in the court!
Ironically, scandals like the 1895 Wilde trial and the public debate they inspired actually contributed to the decline of Victorian sexual ethics, already well underway.
Any newspaper you pick up in the late Victorian, early 20th century, it's filled with explicit reports about court cases and court battles and arrests and police raids and the perversity of this behavior and that behavior. As it's also, of course, a sign of the growing breakdown of the Victorian sex and gender system.
By the end of the century, as the Queen herself whiled away her widowhood in relative anonymity, several other prominent women were speaking out against gender roles and repression. Amelia Bloomer gave her name to a garment designed to free women from their impractical and unhealthy Victorian costumes. Victoria Woodhull, a proponent of free love, argued that even nice girls enjoy sex as much as men. And Josephine Butler joined a fast-growing number of women campaigning for the vote.
I think these kinds of changes in other social arenas are what produce this notion of an end of an era and what change attitudes to sexuality.
By the early 1900s, the Queen was in her grave, and the birth of the modern era was on the horizon. But Victorian sexual values have retained a powerful grip on manners and morals, even in modern-day England and America.
I think the Victorian era has been enormously influential in the way that we understand sexuality today and in the kind of double-edged slight discomfort that we still have with our own comfort about sex.
By the turn of the century, the rumblings of war were beginning to stir Europe from its languid 19th century repose. It would be a war unlike any other, one that would throw the world's nations and cultures into an international melting pot and result in a recipe for sexual revolution.